Oh, hello there. It's the 1930s now, and talkies have taken over cinema, and with them, a new crop of terror is coming from the children of the night. Now, consider this a bit of a friendly warning. If you are one that is terrorized by the occult, the supernatural, or the undead, then this may not be the picture for you. And if that is so, then I suggest that you run. If you look into the history of horror movies, one studio comes up time and time again, and that is Universal Pictures. They're responsible for what we call the modern monster movie, setting the groundwork that films would change and adapt from for the next 100 years. Now, picture 1930s film industry is just now going into sound. And the transition is not smooth. Directors who have worked their entire careers in silent pictures now have to use this new sound technology, and it doesn't go as great as other shifts in the industry with technology advancing. Camera work has to be a lot closer to the actors for the first couple of years so that they can actually be picked up in the microphone, and just it leads to a lot of troubles, including the massive hit that foreign films took because of the introduction of sound. Because if you have a movie that's only in a non-English language, 1930s general anti-foreigner sentiment, it's going to be hard for your movie to get picked up by a big studio with having to add subtitles, as opposed to a picture in English where you can just mass release it to the market. So we see horror movies shift from the German expressionist style over to Hollywood, California, and in 1931 Universal releases probably the two most influential horror movies of that decade, or maybe any other decade, them being Dracula and Frankenstein. Now, both these films are pretty damn similar. The gothic influence is abundant. Damn near every scene is cloaked in lightning and fog. But most importantly, and influential quality of these films are the leads. Bela Lugosi's Dracula and Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster both add a realistic aspect to their characters that allows for more human expression, as opposed to the 1920s villains, which were pretty one-note. These films, because they ascend to a higher, artistic value, from corny old movies to legendary classics. It's no wonder their roles would be impersonated for nearly the next century. There's a reason why people still do Bela Lugosi's Dracula voice, while Nosferatu is regulated to basically being a SpongeBob meme. The fear derived from both these films come from the terrifying idea that something so beyond human, almost otherworldly, could exist. This, combined with the persistent Christian imagery, providing a feeling that you are watching a creature that is straight from hell. What I find more interesting, however, is how these films differ, specifically with the two main monsters. Dracula is a more human evil. He's capable of complex thoughts and sentences and all that, so seeing something so human-looking commit these sinister acts makes it all the more terrifying. Meanwhile, the monster is more of a force of nature. His creation, in and of itself, is an act of defiance against God. Dracula is far more deliberate evil, while the monster is simply an undead being molded by the world around him. Dracula is a monster versus Frankenstein, who becomes a monster because of his environment. Dracula's pacing is also a lot slower than Frankenstein's, which makes it a little bit more difficult to go back and watch. It definitely feels older, even if the two are only separated by 2 months. The horror is also much more subtle. The term horror movie wasn't even around yet, so instead this was labeled a gothic romance. What's great about Dracula is that even when there's no apparent danger for the human characters, there's still this kind of haunting atmosphere, as though they're trapped as soon as they enter Count Dracula's manor. More fantasy than what we consider horror these days, most of the frights come from the atmosphere and Dracula's manipulation of others into his slaves. This is truly the grandfather of psychological horror movies, and I find it unique to compare this to Frankenstein, which is the first, like, straight up monster movie. Dracula is considered a monster movie, but you can definitely tell a difference between Dracula versus, like, Frankenstein, The Mummy, or Creature from the Black Lagoon. I also have to mention the Spanish version, which was created completely separately, but at the same time as the English version. Like, the English production would film during the daytime, then the Spanish crew would come and do it during the night. This was a tradition that kind of died off really quickly because it was just not financially a good idea, but it is probably the better version, as more interesting shot composition and more just like good content going on. However, it doesn't have Bela Lugosi, so just based off of that, I kind of consider it the inferior version compared to the English one. And again, I cannot stress how good Bela Lugosi is in this film. I mean, his body language, speaking pattern, and mannerisms all combine to craft a character that always seems to be hiding something. Bela's ability to play a psychopath without him being super obvious about it will come up in future films throughout the 1930s and into the 40s. Renfield, the human character, is also a great character. A man who slowly falls into insanity. It's as though the evils of Dracula have destroyed his soul. The sound design also goes hard. Most of the time, the film is quiet, almost silent, with each small sound maximizing its effect on the viewer. I mean, there's basically no music, which is an interesting choice by modern standards, but America loved this film. It pushed monsters into the mainstream for movies, and it led to a sequel in 1936, which didn't have Bela Lugosi, titled Daughter of Dracula. This movie leans a lot more into the romantic tragedy side of the source material. It feels like it sometimes has something to say about the nature of life, how it relates to the law, and giving into the sins of one's father. However, oftentimes it kind of just falls apart without Lugosi. Or Dracula in general just isn't in the movie at all. It's instead his daughter, which is fine, but like, just it doesn't hit as hard. We'll talk about the sequels to Frankenstein in a bit, because they're fucking great. But let's talk about the original first. The story is iconic. A mad scientist's obsession to bring life from the dead destroys his life. The monster escapes and terrorizes the countryside, eventually seeking revenge on the man who dared to bring him into this world. Every scene is just filled with images that are burned into film history. I mean, every frame is iconic. The haunting graveyard, the lightning that illuminates every scene as though Frankenstein's experiment is being protested by God himself. The scene at the lake where the monster drowns the girl always gets me. He tries to make a genuine human connection, but because of his abnormal brain, it ends in tragedy. It's an incredible. And that word, tragic, is the best way to describe this movie. The monster has no name, he cannot speak. Boris Karloff does an incredible job humanizing the character through only a couple grunts and mannerisms. He's afraid of fire like an animal, going from large and intimidating to timid and cowardly. Even after he kills the girl and we see the father pass through the town holding his dead child in his arms, I don't find myself rooting for the monster to be killed by the townspeople. In fact, it's kind of sad watching them chase him in the form of a mob, surrounding him by the one thing he fears most, fire. There's a reason the trope of the helpless monster is so popular. It strikes out our fear of the unknown. We don't understand the monster, and thus we must kill him, and it's a good commentary on our human nature. The ending of the movie does fall a bit flat, though. Frankenstein dying with his monster would have been better way to end the movie, in my opinion, though both of them surviving does open up to a sequel, which, unlike Dracula, would actually be better than the first. Both Dracula and Frankenstein brought in a golden era of monster movies. 1 year later, in fact, Boris Karloff would star in another iconic role as The Mummy, and this movie's kind of mid. The opening is great. The opening scene is incredible. Lots of tension as we see the mummy slowly wake up. Then the rest of the movie happens, and falls off after that. The mummy isn't seeking revenge or going on a murder spree. Instead, he's looking for the soul of his lost lover, now found in a young woman he kidnaps. This film gives off major Replicate Dracula vibes. If Karloff or Universal weren't involved in this movie, I doubt we'd really ever be talking about it. at all nowadays, and it's probably the weakest of the movies that are considered part of the Universal Monster series. A movie I love, however, is The Invisible Man. This movie is stupid as hell, and I loved it. The Invisible Man doesn't use his powers to haunt people or go on a murder spree either, but instead of the lame cuck mummy, he just kind of uses his powers to be an asshole, like pushing over bikes and stealing hats type stuff, literally stealing candy from a baby, basically. But what makes this movie comedy gold is that the police characters are constantly portrayed as just the dumbest motherfuckers on the planet. Just the most worthless buffoons you've ever seen. For real. Halfway through this movie, I expect them to slip on a banana peel, fall on their ass while accidentally blowing up the police office. This movie is an easy recommendation. This is a great popcorn movie. Watch it with friends and family. Just great. It's not even a horror movie, really. It's a comedy, and it's a really funny one. Now, if you look up 1930s horror movies, King Kong is pretty much always listed as a horror movie online, so I guess we're counting it. King Kong is awesome, especially for the time. The story is well plotted as well, and the entire movie gives off this adventurous vibe. It's like a fantasy movie. King Kong still holds up and is awesome, a masterpiece of movie making that barely feels like it's a movie from the 30s, except for all the racism. That's kind of bad. It's kind of a bad thing. Maybe don't have that. But there's also a dinosaur, so like, evens it out. While monsters were the most popular subgenre of horror, there's also a couple of notable psychological horror movies at this time. What I love about both the films The Raven and The Black Cat is that both of them are basically just dick measuring contests between Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi on who is better at being evil. Bela plays a psychopathic doctor inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, lots of body horror in The Raven, and Boris plays this former soldier who betrayed his squad and now builds this modernist home atop of a mass grave. But evil is timeless and something. I don't know. I didn't really. I pulled this segment out of my ass, but they're both good movies. You should watch them. But if I had to choose the best horror movie from the 1930s, it would be, of course, The Bride of Frankenstein. This movie is beautiful. The monster survives because Frankenstein cannot simply destroy his attempt to play God. It will continue to haunt him. The humanization of the monster is hinted at in the original, but it's brought to the forefront. It really is the focus in the sequel, which gives Boris Karloff, more room to act, which turns out he's pretty good at. His friendship with the blind man is heartbreaking. The world wants to destroy what we don't understand, and it's only through the radical love of the man who literally cannot see the visual societal standards that we set that the monster can be a person. He's only treated right by someone who cannot see him. This movie is damn near perfect, and it's one of the first examples of advocating for social change in horror movies, and it's a masterpiece. It's like it's already becoming one of my favorite movies of all time. While writing the script, I went back and rewatched it. There's a third movie also in this trilogy called Son of Frankenstein, which takes place many years after the original two, and it's also really good. But I don't really have that much to say about it, but it's still a recommendation. That trilogy of movies, for being three movies from the 1930s, it's insane that they're all so good. They're all easily at least 8 out of 10s, and I'd give Bride of Frankenstein like a 9.5. But, yeah. 1930s horror movies were pretty great, for the most part. There's a couple bad, low-budget ones I didn't get into, like The Walking Dead or The White Zombie, that definitely have aged, and any site that has those movies listed kind of feels like you're letting 5 computer viruses with a trench coat enter your house. So next time, which, who knows when it will be, might just be next year, because I thought that I would be able to get through the entire 100 years of horror in one video, because my hubris has no limits. So look out for the next one, which will be the 1940s, when we face horror's greatest enemy, censorship. And also sequels.
It's not even fucking raining.